On the afternoon of May 7, 1945, in a commandeered German mansion outside Frankfurt, two men who had just helped save the world sat facing each other across an old wooden table. Outside, the sound of celebration was everywhere. American soldiers firing rifles into the air, singing, cheering, drinking whatever German wine they could find. Germany had finally surrendered. The war in Europe was officially over. But inside that quiet room, General George S. Patton was not celebrating. He looked across the table at Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike looked tired but relieved. For him, this was the end of a long nightmare, victory, peace, the chance to go home. But Patton had not come to celebrate. He had come to deliver a warning. Words that would end their friendship. Words that would cost him his career. Words that Washington and the media would later call insane. "We are going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said. His voice was calm but firm. "Let us do it now while our army is intact and we can win." He was not talking about the Germans. Their Reich was in ruins. He was talking about the Soviet Union. For a moment, Eisenhower just stared at him. For 3 years, Ike had held together an alliance with Joseph Stalin's regime. It had not been easy, different ideologies, different goals, different methods. But together they had defeated Adolf Hitler. In American newspapers, Stalin was called Uncle Joe, a rough but reliable partner. Newsreels showed the Red Army as heroic liberators freeing Europe from Nazi tyranny. School children collected scrap metal for the war effort and cheered for their Soviet allies. And here was Patton, the most aggressive general in the American army, calmly suggesting that the United States should turn its guns on that ally immediately, before the dust had even settled, before the celebrations had ended. Attack the Soviets now, while American forces were still mobilized, while the opportunity existed. "George, you do not understand politics," Eisenhower finally said. His voice was steady, patient, like he was explaining something to a child. "The war is over. We are going home." In that instant, Patton saw something that disturbed him more than any battlefield he had ever been on. Eisenhower understood. On some level, Ike knew that what Patton was saying had merit, but he also knew he would never act on it. The political costs were too high. The public would not accept it. Washington would not allow it, so the window would close. The moment would pass, and nothing would be done. What followed was one of the most important silences in American military history, a moment when a decision not to act shaped the next 50 years. Patton had identified a threat, proposed a solution, and been dismissed, not because he was wrong about the threat, but because his solution was politically impossible. Patton had not reached his conclusion from theory or politics. He had reached it from what he had seen with his own eyes. His Third Army had driven deeper into Central Europe than any other Allied force. His tanks had rolled across Germany into Czechoslovakia. His advance units had reached the line where Western forces met Soviet territory. And everywhere he went, he saw something that disturbed him far more than the defeated Germans. He saw the Red Army. Patton's officers and intelligence teams were sending him reports every day. Reports that shocked even men who had spent years in combat. Soviet troops were not behaving like temporary liberators. They were acting like conquerors. Reports came in of systematic looting. Towns stripped of machinery, livestock, food, anything of value loaded onto trains heading east. There were accounts of mass rapes, brutal reprisals against civilians, summary executions of anyone suspected of anti-communist sympathies. Entire communities were being emptied. People loaded onto trains, shipped to Soviet labor camps. Patton did not romanticize war. He knew it was brutal. But what he was seeing in Eastern Europe convinced him that the Soviet Union was not a partner in building a democratic Europe. It was a totalitarian empire expanding west. In April 1945, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice. The letter was personal, private, but it showed what he was thinking. "I have no desire to understand them except to know how much steel it takes to kill them. The Russians give me the impression of something that must be feared in any future arrangement of world power." While American diplomats in Washington still hoped Stalin would respect promises about free elections and self-determination, Patton was watching those promises die on the ground. He met American prisoners of war who had been liberated by Soviet forces. Their stories disturbed him. They said treatment by the Soviets was worse than what the Germans had given them. Soviet soldiers stole their watches, their boots, their food. Officers who protested were beaten or shot. The reports kept coming. Soviet units were dismantling German factories piece by piece, loading entire industrial plants onto rail cars to ship back to Russia. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-backed communists were taking control. Police stations, government ministries, courts, resistance fighters who had risked everything against the Nazis were now being arrested. Interrogated, in many cases executed, not by Germans, by Soviet security forces. By the time Germany surrendered, Patton's concerns had turned into a detailed assessment. What he proposed to Eisenhower was not the outburst of a frustrated warrior. It was a strategic plan based on intelligence reports and battlefield experience. His logic was brutal but simple. The Soviet Union had paid a terrible price to defeat Germany. 27 million dead. The Red Army was massive but exhausted. Its forces in Eastern Europe were stretched far from their supply bases, living off captured supplies, requisitioned food, whatever they could take from the countries they occupied. Their supply lines ran back thousands of miles to a country devastated by war. American forces, by contrast, were at peak strength. They had total control of the air. Their supply lines ran back through France to Atlantic ports, backed by an industrial machine that had never been touched by enemy bombs. American divisions were fully equipped, well-fed, supported by fleets of bombers that could destroy Soviet rail hubs and supply lines at will. To Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson, Patton put it bluntly in May 1945, "We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks." The Soviet Union, he argued, had no real strategic bombing capability. Its air defenses were limited. American air power alone could shred Soviet logistics. On the ground, Soviet tank production was impressive in numbers, but after years of continuous fighting, their tanks were worn out. Mechanically unreliable. American Sherman tanks might not be as heavily armored as some Soviet models, but they were dependable, and there were thousands of them ready for combat. Most important to Patton was the human factor. Soviet soldiers had fought with incredible courage to defend their homeland. But now they were being asked to occupy foreign countries, police populations that did not want them there. Many Soviet troops, Patton believed, had little enthusiasm for permanent occupation duty far from home. If an American offensive drove east, he predicted Red Army morale would break. Many would surrender, desert, refuse to fight. Then Patton said something that horrified Washington. "We can arm the Germans. There are hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers in prisoner camps who would rather fight Russians than sit in cages." To politicians in Washington, this was outrageous. The United States had just sacrificed enormous blood and treasure to defeat Nazi Germany. To arm German soldiers again, even under Allied command, seemed like a betrayal of everything the war had been about. But Patton's reasoning followed a cold logic. German soldiers hated and feared the Soviets more than they hated Americans. If the Soviets were the next threat, why not use the enemy of that enemy? "I would rather have a German division on my side than a Soviet one," he wrote. Within weeks, some of Patton's remarks leaked to the press. The picture painted was not of a strategist making a calculation. It was of a reckless militarist who had gone too far, someone sympathetic to Germans, obsessed with starting another war. Eisenhower had reasons to reject Patton's plan beyond fear of headlines. The American public desperately wanted their sons home. Mothers were writing letters to congressmen demanding their boys' return. Congress was already pushing for rapid demobilization. Logistically, American forces had been positioned to occupy Germany, not to push into Poland and beyond. Supply lines would have to be completely reorganized. But beneath these practical problems lay a bigger barrier: politics. Harry Truman had recently become president after Roosevelt's death. He was still settling into the role, still surrounded by Roosevelt's advisors, still committed to a policy of cooperation with Stalin. At Yalta, the Allies had agreed on a framework for post-war Europe. Zones of occupation, promises of free elections. To propose attacking the Soviet Union now would be seen as tearing up those agreements. Eisenhower understood this completely. If he brought a plan like Patton's to the president, he would be branded a warmonger, a man trying to start World War III just as World War II ended. The press would destroy him. Congress would turn on him. His reputation as the steady architect of victory would be ruined. He also genuinely believed diplomacy could work. Like many leaders at the time, Eisenhower hoped the Soviet Union would moderate once the emergency of war passed. That tensions would ease. That the newly formed United Nations could manage disputes between superpowers. He thought in terms of institutions, treaties, political processes. Patton thought in terms of opportunity and force. "George sees the world as a battlefield," Eisenhower told his chief of staff. "He does not understand that we have to live with these people." In this disagreement, Patton was not entirely alone. Across the English Channel, Winston Churchill was reaching similar conclusions. Churchill had distrusted Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution in 1917. He had only allied with the Soviets out of desperate necessity to defeat Hitler. Even as the war ended, he warned that Soviet aims did not stop with driving out the Nazis. By April 1945, Churchill was sending urgent messages to Truman and Eisenhower. He wanted Western forces to push as far east as possible before the Red Army cemented control. He wanted American and British troops entering Berlin, Prague, and Vienna, not Soviet ones. On May 12, 1945, Churchill used a phrase that would soon become famous. "An iron curtain has been drawn down upon their front," he wrote to Truman. Behind that curtain, he warned, no one knew what was happening, but he suspected freedom was being strangled. That same month, Churchill asked his military planners to draft Operation Unthinkable. It was essentially an Allied offensive aimed at pushing Soviet forces out of Poland and Eastern Europe, using rearmed German units alongside British and American divisions. The British chiefs of staff studied the idea. Their conclusion was sobering, but not dismissive. Under the right conditions, if launched immediately, they believed it was militarily possible. Costly, requiring full commitment, but possible. Churchill sent the plan to Truman. The American president rejected it almost immediately. The thought of attacking the Soviet Union, especially using German soldiers, revolted him. The political and moral implications were too enormous. When Patton learned Churchill had proposed the same strategy, he felt vindicated. "At least one man in power understands what we are facing," he told his staff. Within months, Churchill's fears began coming true. Soviet control over Eastern Europe hardened. Promised elections were delayed, manipulated, or cancelled. Opposition leaders vanished into prisons or graves. Communist parties backed by Soviet security forces took control of police, bureaucracies, and media. Back in the United States, how the media talked about Patton shifted. During the war, he had been a colorful hero, the flamboyant tank commander whose speeches inspired troops and terrified Germans. In May and June 1945, the tone changed. Journalists seized on his harsh comments about Soviets and his idea of rearming Germans. Columnist Drew Pearson described Patton's statements as deeply troubling, suggesting his judgment was slipping. At a moment when the country longed for peace, Pearson said, Patton seemed intent on courting another war. Editorials argued his remarks showed dangerous ignorance of diplomatic reality. Magazines wondered if this brilliant battlefield commander was simply incapable of adapting to peacetime. None of these outlets seriously investigated the reports from Eastern Europe. They did not look into Soviet atrocities or the installation of puppet governments. The narrative hardened. Patton was a superb warrior, but an unstable relic unsuited to the new era. Pressure on Eisenhower increased. By August 1945, Washington was making clear that Patton's public criticisms were unacceptable. The trigger came from a different debate entirely: denazification. At a press conference, Patton was asked about efforts to purge all former Nazi Party members from German administration. He responded with characteristic bluntness. Many of these people, he argued, had joined the party for practical reasons, not ideology. To remove them all from office was idiotic. He compared it to an American political contest. Said belonging to the Nazi Party in Germany was often no more serious than being a Democrat or Republican at home. The remark exploded. Reported without context, it sounded like Patton was equating participation in a murderous totalitarian movement with membership in a Democratic Party. Headlines accused him of trivializing Nazi crimes. Politicians denounced him. The controversy gave Eisenhower the excuse he needed. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of Third Army. Officially, the reason was his inappropriate comments about denazification. Unofficially, everyone knew his warnings about the Soviets played an equal role. Stripped of operational command, Patton spent his final months observing, writing, and warning. His letters from October and November 1945 read like prophecy. He urged American leaders to maintain strength, keep boots polished, bayonets sharpened, show the Red Army unmistakable power. This, he insisted, was the only language Moscow respected. If the United States disarmed and relaxed, victory over Germany would be hollow. They might have defeated one enemy only to hand the field to another. In early December, Patton met again with Under-Secretary Patterson. He laid out his forecast. The Soviets would not withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would transform temporary occupation into permanent control. They would spread communism through Western Europe. Eventually, the United States would be drawn into military confrontation. We are going to fight them eventually, in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, and we will wish we had done it in 1945 when we had the chance. Patterson listened politely, then gave the same answer Eisenhower had given. Washington had no appetite for confrontation. The American public wanted peace. Whatever Patton saw, his proposed response was politically impossible. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was in a collision near Mannheim. A truck suddenly turned in front of his vehicle. The general was thrown forward. His neck broke. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. Other passengers had minor injuries. Patton, who had survived countless dangers at the front, was mortally injured in what looked like a routine traffic accident. He lingered in a hospital bed for nearly 2 weeks, unable to move. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died at age 60. The timing and strange circumstances fueled speculation immediately. Some pointed to odd details about the truck driver. Others noted the coincidence that the most outspoken general about the Soviet threat had been silenced days after making a final prediction to Washington. But no credible evidence of assassination ever surfaced. The more sober conclusion is that it was a tragic accident that nevertheless removed the loudest voice demanding confrontation with Moscow. In the years that followed, events unfolded exactly as Patton warned. By 1946, Soviet power in Eastern Europe was entrenched. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all fell under communist control. The free elections promised at Yalta proved to be illusions. In Poland, resistance leaders who fought the Nazis for 6 years were arrested, tried on fake charges, and executed or sent to labor camps. In Czechoslovakia, a communist coup in 1948 overthrew the democratic government. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a mysterious fall from a window, officially suicide, widely suspected murder. The pattern repeated: Soviet presence followed by communist governments, suppression of opposition, nationalization of property, secret police forces loyal to Moscow. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe killed roughly 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or lived under everyday repression. The Iron Curtain Churchill envisioned became a literal border of barbed wire, concrete walls, and watchtowers. The Cold War that Patton wanted to prevent lasted 45 years. Cost trillions in military spending, claimed millions of lives in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly ended. The age of mutual annihilation began. By 1950, confronted with North Korean aggression backed by Moscow and Beijing, the United States found itself in exactly the military clash with communist forces Patton predicted. Except now, under far more dangerous conditions. Patton's argument had never been that war with the Soviets could be avoided. His claim was that May 1945 was the least dangerous time to face them. The Red Army exhausted, Soviet industry shattered, American power at its peak. If confrontation was inevitable, better then than later when Soviets had regrouped, rearmed, and acquired nuclear weapons. Whether his military assessment was entirely correct remains debated. What is not debatable is that his warnings were borne out. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe became permanent until the late 1980s. Communist expansion spread globally. Military confrontation with communist forces occurred repeatedly at high cost. By 1947, Even liberals who supported Roosevelt's hopeful approach had to admit something fundamental went wrong. George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow described the Soviet regime as inherently expansionist. Language that in more measured tone closely mirrored Patton's warnings from 1945. The Truman Doctrine that same year committed the United States to containing Soviet influence. But containment came with tragic trade-offs. It accepted Soviet control over Eastern Europe as fate. It meant fighting limited wars in Asia instead of risking general conflict in Europe. It meant living for decades under nuclear annihilation's shadow. Conservative critics later seized on Patton as prophetic, a man who saw what others refused. General Douglas MacArthur, who clashed with Truman over Korean War strategy, wrote that Patton understood communism had to be confronted militarily. His removal was a tragedy with long consequences. Decades later, Ronald Reagan invoked Patton's warnings, arguing the United States must adopt strength and clarity toward what he called the evil empire. When the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, some pointed back to Patton's May 1945 conversation with Eisenhower. If Soviet system could ultimately be broken by pressure, perhaps in some alternate history where Patton's advice was heeded, Eastern Europe might have been freed 45 years earlier. But whether Patton's proposed offensive would have succeeded is ultimately unanswerable. The political reality of 1945 made his plan unimaginable for democratic leaders. No matter military chances, the United States and Britain were weary, their people desperate for peace. They had just emerged from a cataclysm whose horrors were still being uncovered. To launch another war immediately against a recent ally was asking something they could not provide. Patton's tragedy was not simply being right. It was being right at a moment when his country could not act on that truth. His story poses questions that remain. When should the United States confront emerging threats militarily rather than diplomatically? How far should generals go advocating strategies militarily sound but politically impossible? When do leaders have duty to ignore public opinion and act preemptively? Similar debates echoed after September 11th, when policymakers argued over preemptive force against terrorist networks. They echo again as America grapples with China's rise. Do you confront a rival early while strength favors you, or wait and hope engagement moderates their ambitions? Patton represents one pole, the warrior who believes threats should be crushed while vulnerable. Eisenhower in 1945 represented the other, the coalition builder who believes in diplomacy, institutions, and political processes grinding slowly forward. Eisenhower's handling of Patton can be read two ways. One interpretation says the system worked. A general refusing civilian guidance was relieved. Military power remained subordinate to elected authority. Another interpretation says the system failed. A general correctly identifying strategic danger was sidelined because warnings were inconvenient. Eisenhower later acknowledged underestimating Soviet threat in early post-war years, but he never conceded Patton's suggestion of immediate military action was wise or feasible. From his perspective, politics, troop morale, and obligations made such moves irresponsible. Patton did not care about political feasibility. He cared about defeating what he saw as America's next enemy before that enemy grew stronger. That was his lens for viewing history, war, and duty. He died December 21, 1945, in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, far from the front lines he loved. At his request, he was buried among Third Army soldiers in Luxembourg, the men with whom he fought and bled. In death, Patton became symbol. To many conservatives, he embodied clarity and courage to name evil and advocate force. To many liberals, he symbolized militarism's dark side, the man too easily reaching for war as solution. To most public, he remained the fiery tank commander who helped break Hitler's grip. The question of whether Patton was right about the Soviet Union was answered not by arguments, but by events. Permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe for decades, global communist expansion, Cold War reshaping world politics until 20th century's end. Whether his remedy would have prevented that history or plunged the world into something worse, we will never know. What we do know is George S. Patton saw in spring 1945 a danger others preferred not to face. He spoke bluntly, refused to be quiet. Paid with his career and possibly his life. Leaders who dismissed his warnings spent next 45 years struggling to manage consequences of the reality he tried to confront. His voice echoes still. A reminder that sometimes the person seeing most clearly is also most easily labeled dangerous, unhinged, extreme. Sometimes the prophet is pushed aside, the truth teller silenced, and the warrior insisting on naming the next enemy is removed by politicians preferring comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths.